A 4-foot iron tool worn smooth by thousands of calloused hands. But this wasn't a craftsman's creation. It was shaped by railroad workers under the blazing sun, the blunt head and angled face telling a story of backbreaking labor that built America's endless iron rails. The iron is heavy, heavier than it looks. You would feel it in your shoulders by mid-morning and in your lower back by noon. The head is not decorative. There is nothing elegant about it. It was made to be driven down, again and again, into crushed stone and compacted earth, working a material into place beneath something that weighed more than any man could lift. There is no spring mechanism, no adjustment screw, no clever folding joint. Just iron, wood, and the physics of force. Take a good look. Do you know what this was for? Most people walking past it at an estate sale would pick it up, turn it over once or twice, and set it back down without a clue. But for about 50 years, this tool touched every mile of railroad track laid across the American continent. And without it, the iron horse would have gone nowhere at all. That is a tamping iron. And the story of what it did, how it was used, and why it vanished is the story of the muscle and grit beneath the most transformative infrastructure project in American history. Before we talk about the tamping iron itself, let us set the scene, because these tools do not exist in a vacuum. They exist in the hands of real men, on real ground, under a real sky. The year is somewhere in the 1860s, and you are standing in the middle of nowhere, which is to say, somewhere in the Great Plains, or the Sierra Nevada foothills, or the red dirt corridors of the American South. There is a crew of perhaps a dozen men ahead of you, and a dozen behind you. Some are spiking rails. Some are laying cross ties, those thick rectangular cuts of timber that the rails rest upon. And then there is your job. Once the tie is positioned and the rail is spiked, the ballast, that angular crushed stone, or sometimes packed gravel, or in early construction even plain dirt, has to be driven tight beneath and around each tie so that the whole structure holds firm, does not shift under load, does not sink unevenly, and send the engine tipping into a gully. That work, that process of driving the ballast material into solid, uniform compression beneath and around the ties, is called tamping. And the tool that did it was the tamping iron. The mechanics were brutally simple and brutally physical. A worker, called a tamper, would stand to the side of the rail, drive the iron head of the tool down into the ballast beside the tie, and work it with a prying, packing motion, angling the blade face to force stone and earth beneath the wood. Then he would step, drive again, step, drive again, working his way down the length of the tie to ensure even support from end to end. If the tamping was done well, the tie sat firm and level. If it was rushed or skipped, the rail would eventually develop what engineers called a low joint, a soft, spongy section where the track would dip slightly under the weight of each passing wheel. Low joints caused rough rides. They caused accelerated wear on rolling stock. And in the worst cases, at speed, they caused derailments that could kill every passenger aboard. So the tamping iron was not a peripheral implement. It was not a finishing touch. It was the difference between a railroad and a ruin. And the men who swung it, Chinese laborers on the Central Pacific, Irish immigrants on the Union Pacific, Black freedmen, and convict laborers on southern lines. These men worked in conditions that are almost impossible to fully comprehend from this distance. The pay was low. The hours were long. The repetitive impact of the tamping iron traveled up through the handle into already exhausted arms hundreds of times a day. And yet the track went down, mile after mile after mile, straight and true, because someone tamped it right. Here is a detail that catches most people off guard. The tamping iron was not a single standardized design. Early versions were little more than a shaped iron bar with a basic wooden handle pinned in place. But over time, different manufacturers and different railroad contractors produced their own variations. Some heads were wider for working softer ballast. Some had a narrower, more aggressive blade angle for dense, compacted gravel. A tamping iron recovered from a Central Pacific work camp might look noticeably different from one used on a Gulf coastline a decade later. Collectors today sometimes find these in groups, having been stored together in old railroad section houses. Those small wooden buildings, often painted a weathered red or yellow, that sat at intervals along the right-of-way and served as the home base for the maintenance crews who kept each section of track in repair. Did your grandfather work on the railroad, or keep tools like this in his barn or his shed? There was a time when these implements were common enough that retired rail workers brought them home, leaned them against the back wall of the garage, used them for odd jobs in the garden. Tell me in the comments. I would love to hear those stories. Now here is where the open loop closes. The tamping iron, for all its essential role, carried within it a structural problem that would eventually seal its fate. The tool depended entirely on the skill and consistency of the individual man using it. No two workers tamped exactly alike. Some were more thorough at the center of the tie. Some favored one side. The result was that even on freshly laid track, the quality of the ballast compaction varied from tie to tie, from mile to mile, from crew to crew. Railroad engineers knew this. They had known it since the early days of American railroading, and it nagged at them, because inconsistent tamping meant inconsistent track geometry, and inconsistent track geometry meant speed limits had to be kept lower than the locomotives could otherwise handle. The answer, when it eventually came, was mechanization. By the early 20th century, experimental mechanical tampers began to appear, steam-powered at first, then eventually internal combustion, and finally the sophisticated electro-hydraulic tamping machines that you might see beside a track today. Enormous yellow machines that look nothing like that iron bar you are holding in your imagination. These machines could tamp thousands of ties per hour with consistent, measured force, applying precisely calibrated pressure at exactly the right points beneath each tie. The human tamper, the man with his 4-foot iron bar and his aching shoulders, could not compete with that. And so by the mid-20th century, the tamping iron was largely retired from mainline railroad use, surviving longest on smaller regional lines and in the hands of maintenance-of-way crews doing hand correction work in tight places where the machine could not easily reach. What we are left with now are the ones that survived, leaning in old sheds, turning up at farm auctions in states that once had busy rail corridors, resting in the back corners of antique shops where the owner is not quite sure what to call them. They are heavy when you pick them up, heavier than you expect for something so plain. And that weight is honest. It is the weight of honest work, of a country being stitched together one tie at a time, in heat and dust and cold rain, by men whose names do not appear in any history book, but whose labor is the reason the history of this country moved as fast as it did. Every spike driven into every rail needed the ground beneath it to hold. And someone had to do that tamping. Someone had to show up every morning and pick up the iron and do the work that made everything else possible. That is what this tool is. That is what it meant. Not glamorous, not clever, not particularly beautiful. Just necessary, in the most complete sense of that word. These tools built this country, and we let them fade. Hit subscribe so they are not forgotten, and tell me below if your family owned one.